Hello everybody, and welcome to my new channel, Ruther Bit. Ruther Bit is Irish for anything at all, and that's pretty much what I started this channel to talk about. Just any random stories that I find interesting that I want to share with you guys. And the first story I want to share is the very oddly specific voyage of Russia's Second Pacific Fleet during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Now, before you click away thinking this is going to just be a story about boats, it's not that at all. It's a wild story that keeps getting just stupider and stupider the more you go on, and ended up having some pretty huge ramifications for the rest of the 20th century. So let's get into it. Before we embark, however, I'd be remiss if I didn't give at least a quick shout out to our two biggest sources for this video. First is episode 121 of the Incredible Lives Led by Donkeys podcast by Joe Casabia. He does a 4-part series that goes into the land battles as well, which is outside the scope of this video. But if you want to find out more about that, give those episodes a listen. My biggest source for the video, though, is The Fleet That Had to Die by naval historian Richard Hough. It goes into a lot of details that the average person would be completely clueless about, like me, and he manages to do it in a very readable 200 or so pages. So if you like what you see today, be sure to check them out. Links to both of those, as well as all of my other sources, will be down in the description below. To get this story started, I'm going to have to yada my way through some important 1900s geopolitics, so stick with me here. Russia at this point is still ruled over by the Romanov dynasty, rulers of 1/6 of the landmass of Earth. But because this clearly wasn't enough, they also had eyes on Manchuria in northern China, mainly so that they could put down some really nice train tracks. They also had eyes on Korea because they wanted a warm water port. It's the story of Russian history. On the other hand, you had Japan, who, taking a look at what the Europeans and Americans were doing, had started colonizing some stuff of their own, and since the 1890s had gone on to conquer quite a bit of land across Southeast Asia. Problem arose when they also wanted Manchuria, but they really wanted Korea. Neither side wanted a war though. Russia was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, famously incompetent and terrible at committing to any one idea. Japan, on the other hand, was a tiny island nation who had just started their empire and didn't want to go up against someone with a 300-year-long head start and more surface area than Pluto. Luckily for all involved, Tsar Nicholas II sent in the absolutely unhinged Alexander Mikhailovich Bezobrazov to act as a diplomat. He strained relations to the point of war many times until cooler heads prevailed, but eventually Japan got sick of this will they or won't they, until the night of February 8, 1904, when Japanese Admiral Togo Iechiro launched a surprise attack on the Russian ships at Port Arthur. This is where their Pacific Fleet was, and the attack was completely devastating and destroyed most of the Pacific Fleet. This was the only real naval power that Russia controlled. And that kickstarted the Russo-Japanese War and is about all of the information we're going to need from here on out. So, let's relax, grab a drink, as we learn about how the little island nation of Japan brought the Russian bear to its knees and altered history forever. Now, Tsar Nicholas II is humiliated at the loss of the Pacific Fleet, and like me, he fancies himself a bit of a sailor boy. So he hatches a plan that's so devious yet so daring that it just might work. All he has to do is take his Baltic fleet, located in the Baltic Sea, outfitted for war, sail it all the way to Port Arthur, where it could fight the Japanese, lift the naval blockade, and free the remains of the First Pacific Fleet. All that stood in the way was a measly 33,000 kilometer journey, but after this minor global circumnavigation was completed, then he would show Japan who was boss. The man put in charge of preparations is one Zinovy Rozhestvensky, a man whose only battle experience up until now had been losing a battle in the Russo-Turkish War. After the war, it was found out that he had falsified reports, but he was still promoted to lieutenant of the Baltic Fleet anyway. So serious about his job was he, that he had a fun quirk of just throwing binoculars overboard at whatever ship he was angry at. His subordinates quickly learned to bring a crate of 50 spare binoculars with him wherever he went. So, first things first. We need to rename the Baltic Fleet to the Second Pacific Fleet. So far, so easy. Now, it's time to actually prepare the ships. Since time was of the essence here, Rojestvensky would have to take to using some new speedrunning strats with varying degrees of success. This wasn't helped by the fact that he quickly became hated by pretty much everybody who had to work with him because of his hard-assedness. But can you blame him? He has a job of preparing over 40 ships to undertake what was, and still is, a near impossible undertaking. And now there were still some glaring problems with the Baltic Fleet. Second Pacific Fleet. First was that it was the Baltic Fleet, built for the calm waters of the Baltic Sea, not wide open oceans. Definitely not that of the storm-ridden Pacific Ocean. The second problem was that the Navy only got 6 months of training per year before the waters would freeze over, and the Russian Navy would transition to what I imagine is the Russian figure skating team. And now with new ships on the way, the Tsar just starts conscripting dudes from all over the Empire to serve in the Navy. Now, one thing you may have noticed, for such a chode of a country, a lot of Russia is landlocked. And so a lot of these men had never seen anything bigger than a fishing boat or a river vessel. Not only that, but a lot of them didn't even know how to swim. Inexperience wasn't the only problem with the men on board, however, as there were saboteurs aboard. Revolutionary and Marxist saboteurs, to be exact. Since this is over a decade before the Bolshevik takeover, they weren't Leninists or anything, because Leninists didn't exist. They were just a random motley crew of people with random leftist beliefs who couldn't agree on any real issues. Thankfully, leftists today have changed and can have civil discussions and reach agreement on everything. One of the revolutionaries even wrote in his diary, "If we gain the victory over the Japanese, we should hinder the revolution." While this might sound like a man with a death wish, it actually tells us a lot about Russian culture at the time. If you know anything about Russia, especially in this time period, you know that nihilism seeped into every facet of daily life. Mix that with a belief called accelerationism, the belief that the only way to end monarchy was to mess it up so disastrously bad that ordinary people would have no choice but to get rid of the monarchy. Mix this with a belief that an individual's life is meaningless, and you get a lot of young men willing to die just to give the Tsar a middle finger. The problem of men sorted, it was now time to start actually worrying about the ships. One attempt to bolster numbers was to just confiscate fishing vessels and pleasure yachts from the wealthy and outfit them for war. Now don't get me wrong, I'm all for taking yachts away from rich people, but these were small ships designed for crews of no bigger than 2 or 3 dozen men, and now you want to strap a bunch of heavy armour and cannons onto them. The added weight predictably caused a lot of these ships to capsize or just outright sink due to the added weight. At one point, they even had the bright idea of trying to add armour to a ship before dry docking it, which meant cutting a hole in the side and putting more armour in. Now, if you're thinking, oh wait, if the ship is in the water and it has a hole, won't it sink? Well, then congratulations, you're more qualified than most men working on this job, because the ship did in fact sink. Somehow, after all of the hijinks, the Armada was getting ready to set sail. All in all, there was a random medley of 42 ships with a haphazard crew of 10,000 men. But now their next problem arose, and that was fuel. Sailing the fleet would take 3,000 to 10,000 tons of coal per day. Even docked, just keeping the lights on will burn through 500 tons. So now Rojestvensky has to somehow work out the logistics of scrounging together over 500,000 tons of coal for the trip. For other seafaring empires like Britain or France, this was no problem, as they had colonies overseas that could keep them chugging along. But Russia doesn't have overseas empires. And to make matters worse, people in Europe didn't have beef with Japan, but they had a lot of beef with Russia, so no one wanted to take their side in this conflict. The closest thing that Russia had to an ally was Germany, ruled by Nicholas's cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Stupid and all as that man was, even he knew that letting a Russian armada dock up and take a bunch of coal wouldn't have been a great luck to his people. So he agreed to just sell them the lowest grade coal possible that would just about keep the ships plodding along. So they reached a new plan, coaling ships, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Ships would go to shore, load up on coal, bring them out to sea, and load them up onto the armada. This had been done before, but never to this scale, and never in these conditions. So let's see how it works out for them. All preparations complete, it was finally time to get going. But before that, they took the opportunity to get in some training. But would you believe it, another problem arose. This time the problem of ammunition. See, there's a reason that all armies, navies, whatever, use the same calibers of guns for standard weaponry. So that way, no matter how many guns or cannons you have, you only need to stock up on a few different types of ammunition. But since the Second Pacific Fleet was made up of old ships with random guns and cannons, ammunition logistics quickly became a nightmare. They barely had enough training for a full-scale battle, never mind the thousands upon thousands of rounds it would have taken to get these rascals into fighting order. So they ran a training exercise, and not a single target was hit. But that's no reason to call anything off. They'll learn en route. Maybe. So with that all done, finally, our lovable team of drunkards, peasants, and communists set sail on their hero's voyage. In the first few days after departure, 2 Russian ships got stuck in various harbours due to being overloaded. Another ship mysteriously sank, possibly due to communist sabotage, and a third vessel was fired upon before it was realised that it was a friendly chartered vessel that was actually delivering a promotion to Rozhestvensky. Thankfully, due to Russian inaccuracy, the ship was completely unharmed, and he still somehow received the promotion to Vice Admiral Zenoviy Rozhestvensky. But the men on board were still anxious. And rightfully so, the Japanese had a terrifying navy. But now rumours of Japanese spies on board started to take hold. And then Japanese spy balloons were spotted in the skies above them, and the men started to panic. So a lot of the ships took to radio silence for fear of being intercepted by the Japanese while they were still in Scandinavian waters. It was during this radio silence that all hell broke loose. All of a sudden, officers were drawing swords and barking commands. Men drew rifles while others donned their life vests. Men were screaming as shells were unleashed, some of them even hitting their target and landing strikes on Russian ships. This was it. Somehow the Japanese had beat them at their own crazy game and had gotten to Scandinavian waters, and except it wasn't the Japanese. Obviously. Somehow, Russia had actually engaged with a small fleet of British fishing vessels, despite the fact that they were waving Union Jacks, shining spotlights, and firing off flares to try and tell the Russians, we're just fishermen. At one point, one of the fishermen even held up a large haddock into the air to signify, we're just here for fish. But the bombardment continued for 20 minutes, and when the smoke cleared, it turned out that 2 British fishermen had died, 6 were injured, and 1 of their ships were sunk. But the Russians somehow matched those numbers, when 2 Russians died, one of which was an Orthodox chaplain on board, when a 45mm shell flew into his room and obliterated him. As if they hadn't had enough signs now that this is a bad idea. They had as clear as a sign from God himself that this is a bad idea, but nah. Russia went up against an unarmed fishing fleet and somehow barely managed a 1-to-1 KD ratio. As always, Russia's greatest enemy is itself. This would go down as the Dogger Bank incident and very, very, very nearly came close to starting a war with Britain. Because at this point in time, fishermen are about as British as fish and chips or colonization, so you don't mess with the fishermen. But eventually, after many apologies, war was barely avoided and the fleet continued on their merry way. Barely avoiding an international incident, the fleet made its way to Morocco, where it was decided that they were going to split the party, with the larger ships heading down all the way around the south coast of Africa and the smaller ships heading through the Suez Canal, where they would all rendezvous at Madagascar. It's unsure why this was the plan, because even the larger ships could fit in the Suez Canal, but this is the plan nonetheless. But to get one last shenanigan in before they left, a Russian ship, while departing, accidentally severed telegraph lines between Tangier and France, severing communications between France and Africa for 4 days. One of their last chances to refuel for a while would be at Dakar, where 10 coal ships awaited them. Knowing he might not get the chance again anytime soon, Rozhestvensky ordered an obscene amount of coal, with ships taking on more than twice what would fill their coal bunkers. some of the larger ships were forced to take on over 2,200 tons of the black stuff. One of the higher-ups even said, "What on earth are we to do? I never heard of such a thing. How can I possibly keep the ships clean with 1,000 tons of coal lying about in odd corners?" Here's the neat part. You don't. Because coal was ordered to be stored in, among other places, cockpits, bathrooms, engine room workshops, and just rolling around loose on the quarterdeck. Rojestvensky said that so long as engineers could still work and that the sailors were not asphyxiated, then all would be fine. Except all was not fine, as this next leg of the journey is what Richard Hough would describe as an ordeal by coal. And he was bang on, because for the next 4 months the sailors were just crammed into quarters surrounded by coal. To make matters even worse, this coal was being jostled by the ship's vibrations, sending plumes of coal dust into the air, where it would mix with the humidity of the African coastline and become a oozy, coaly liquid. Soon this sooty miasma permeated everything, from sailors' clothes, eyes, mouths, food, even their pores were clogged with the stuff. Men's moods obviously quickly began to sour. This quagmire of coal quickly warped the interior of ships and men alike, with a lot of men being sent to the infirmary and some even just dropping dead from the whole ordeal. The crew that went all the way around the south coast of Africa actually arrived at Madagascar first. Well, to be more specific, they arrived at Nossi Bay, a small island off the east coast of Madagascar. When they got there, Rojestvensky received some bad news. First of all, he found out that what remained of the First Pacific Fleet had been destroyed. This threw the whole operation into question, as the Second Pacific Fleet's entire job was to lift the blockade at Port Arthur and reunite with the First Pacific Fleet. That way they would at least have some modern Pacific ships for the fight, and then they could perform some sort of pincer attack. I'm not too sure. I'm not a naval battle expert. Anyway, with the First Pacific Fleet destroyed, their chances of winning were lowered significantly. To make matters even worse, Rojestvensky was told that there was now a third Pacific Fleet being thrown together even more haphazardly than the last. To rub more salt in the wound, the third Pacific Fleet was being arranged by one of his rivals, one Admiral Nabokov. After hearing all of this, Rojestvensky asked to be relieved of his command. And he just disappeared for 2 days. Nobody had seen him. During these 2 days, of course, the sailors started to talk, and rumors circulated. So after the 2 days, Rojestvensky gathers the men on the flagship Suvorov on Russian Christmas, or the 7th of January for us non-Russian Orthodox folk. He confirms the rumors that yes, the First Pacific Fleet is destroyed, which sends the men into a deep depression, as they know they're probably not going to win without the First Pacific Fleet, and now they know they will never see their families or their fatherland ever again. But because it is Christmas, and because they're Russian, they're given vodka to toast, and Rojestvensky gives an emotional speech to the crew. This can't be helped. It is war. It is not for me to thank you for your services. You as well as I serve our country side by side. At this, Rojestvensky gulped down his vodka along with his other men while they screamed and chanted, "We won't give in," and "We'll do it." And to that I say, Szczęśliwego Rождества, товарищ. How does anyone drink straight vodka? A few weeks pass, and the ships that were sent to the Suez Canal reach Nossi Bay, and the Armada is together again. And this is where the story gets stupid. So, the biggest town on the island is very appropriately called Hellville, and true to form, the sailors do their very best to recreate a Hieronymus Bosch painting. Rojestvensky is torturing himself in his cabin with battle plans and dispatches back to the fatherland. While he is doing that, the sailors are doing what sailors do best. They are drinking, they are gambling, And how do I say this without being demonetized? They are engaging with the female population who require money. They're doing this so much that inflation runs rampant on the island. The biggest bar has to build an extension just to deal with the extra foot traffic. The owner of said bar even jokes that when the sailors leave, he will be able to retire to Paris. What happens next is they start to collect animals. Firstly, they collect livestock, and this makes sense. This is before the days of refrigeration, so if you want meat, you need to bring animals on board and butcher them whenever the men get hungry. What makes less sense is the cadre of exotic animals that they bring on board next. Parrots, porcupines, chameleons, monkeys, frogs, snakes, what have you, all start to be must-have items. This causes some problems. Firstly, the animal feces starts to mix with the coal and makes a bad situation even worse. One crewman is even sent to the infirmary because he got bit in the leg by a snake, causing his leg to swell up massively. Next is it's an apocryphal story, but incredible if true. They bring a crocodile on board, and he takes a liking to one of the certain areas of the ship. All of the men, because it's a crocodile, are too terrified to go down there, making this the only time in history that I am aware of where a crocodile performed an act of piracy. Then they start getting dogs and monkeys drunk and betting on them who would win in fights. So you may ask, where are the commanding officers during all of this? Well, they are just as depressed and hopeless and in need of entertainment as everybody else, so they just kind of let it happen. Romanovs, whether it was coal or climate or possibly just a rage-filled feeling, he went into a barely comatose state for a few weeks. Romanovs wasn't the only one who was sick, however, as soon a lot of the men started to come down with cases of syphilis due to their activities on the island. I tried to be clever and introduce this by using the Latin name, but it turns out syphilis is the Latin name. But the Romans also used the nickname the French disease, which is funny because they're on a French colony, so sometimes history just writes the jokes for you. Now, left to no supervision, the men pretty much turned into Philadelphia football fans, and they started just tearing down infrastructure on the island in drunken stupors. Mutinies started and men were arrested. And this all came to a head when French officials visited Romanovs in his sick bed and said, "We don't care if you're sick, you can't do this on our colony." So try to put yourself in Romanovs' shoes for a second. He wakes up to see his ships have been turned into floating zoos. Men are arrested awaiting court-martial. Other men are in the infirmary due to STIs or climate or coal-related illnesses. Another big problem is that a lot of the men started drinking seawater because they ran out of fresh water. And what do you do? Well, Romanovs ordered all exotic animals to be thrown overboard, and he banned shore leave immediately. So that dulled things down a little bit. But during all of this, one of the men wrote in his diary, "Food for the fishes. That's all we're good for now," which is a pretty good way of telling where emotions were at the minute. So they decided to lift the spirits of all the men by bringing Russian newspapers, because they thought, give them a little taste of home. That'll cheer them up. But ironically enough, this made things so much worse, because what was in the newspapers at the moment was the Bloody Sunday Massacre of 1905, where civilians tried to protest against the Tsar, and 2,000 civilians were murdered by the Russian Imperial Guard. So now the soldiers thought, okay, there's no First Pacific Fleet, so we're already kind of going on a death march. But now they're finding out that the Russian Empire itself is on its last legs. So what is the point of giving our life for an empire that's clearly dying? Romanovs tries to lift spirits again by holding another training exercise. The only target that was hit was a friendly vessel that was towing a target into range. So the men aren't feeling too great at this point. Let's put it that way. By March, Rozhesvensky had had enough of his time in Madagascar, and he said, we're either going to die in battle or we're going to die here in Nossi Bay, so we may as well die in battle. So by the 16th of March, smoke was again billowing from the pipes and they were setting sail. Meanwhile, the 3rd Pacific Fleet was still refueling in Crete, where they were described as self-sinkers and an archaeological collection of naval architecture. So Rozhesvensky decided, if we leave now, we might just lose them and they won't slow us down. Meanwhile, the 3rd Pacific Fleet, when they got to Djibouti, Admiral Bogatov wired home saying, hey, so where do we rendezvous with the 2nd Pacific Fleet? To which the Russian government just replied, their route is unknown to us. Because from March 16th up until April 8th, no one knew where the 2nd Pacific Fleet was. And so they just said, just keep heading east. We'll let you know. And eventually, on April 8th, the 2nd Pacific Fleet was spotted off the coast of Singapore, where a journalist from Reuters described the scene thusly. The ships, magnificent but foul, were proceeding at about 8 knots, and it took them 35 minutes to pass a given point. All the vessels showed signs of their long voyage in tropical sea, about a foot of seaweed being visible along the waterline, and the decks were laden with coal. I'm just imagining how funny it is, someone off the coast with binoculars looking at the ships, and they can still just see the stacks of coal. With the new press coverage, this Russian fleet had gone from a rickety, thrown together pile of scrap into the underdogs, and people are starting to say, okay, maybe they could do this thing. Because remember, it was still 1905, and they had sailed all the way from Western Russia to Singapore in ships that were not built for this at all. The likes of this had never been seen and has never been seen again, not even in World War II. So all of a sudden, people are starting to kind of root for the guys. Even the British had started to get over their Dogger Bank incident and were starting to write about how, yeah, these guys are pretty good. They could get it. Who knows? And eventually the 2nd Pacific Fleet reached Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam, at which point Rozhesvensky telegraphed back home, British cruisers are radioing reports of my movements to Tokyo. I will not telegraph again before the battle. If I am beaten, Togo will tell you. If I beat him, I will let you know. Along with that, Rozhesvensky also told the fatherland, I'm only waiting here for as long as I have coal to reach Port Arthur. If the 3rd Pacific Fleet is here by then, great. If not, we're leaving with or without them. But miraculously, the 3rd Pacific Fleet caught up with them. And now, 2nd and 3rd Pacific Fleet, they were together for the first time, together again. And now, on paper, the Russians outnumbered the Japanese. So if you were a betting man at the time, it could have gone either way. Sure, the Japanese had more experience and more modern ships, but the Russians had the numbers. But with Rozhesvensky and the boys now approaching the Gulf of Tsushima, they were too worried about the upcoming battle to worry about the absolute beauty and majesty that is the cliffs of Tsushima, because now they were close enough to finally start picking up Japanese radio signals. So the Russians swapped the flag-based semaphore system so that their signals couldn't be read. The men started seeing some Japanese scouting ships staying just tantalizingly out of reach of their cannons. Despite all of this, moods on board were jovial. Partly because the sailors had come all of this way, and now they knew one way or another it was all going to end tomorrow. Whether they would die and end their suffering, or somehow succeed and go home as heroes, either way, it was all going to be done with. Another reason why they were all happy was because it actually happened to fall on the anniversary of the coronation of the Tsar and Tsarina. So they were all given vodka, again, to toast to the Tsar's health. Now, Rozhesvensky left the peasants to drink their potato water, while he went down to drink champagne with the other officers. But before their glasses were drained, the first shots were fired, and so began the Battle of Tsushima. Now, when the battle actually started, it looked like it could go either way, due to the Russians actually being able to hit a target for once, and the Japanese were taking massive risks. But again, later on it was found out these risks were done because Togo knew his men were capable. The Japanese bombarded the Russians for 1 hour with devastating explosive rounds. There was just fire and death everywhere along the gunnery decks. The Suvorov, the flagship of the Russian fleet, lost their helmsman and their entire medical crew within that 1 hour. It looks like the holy water that the priests blessed the guns with didn't do a whole lot. After that 1 hour, the Japanese swapped to phase 2, armor-piercing rounds. These were devastatingly accurate, and from this point on, the Russians wouldn't get a single hit on a Japanese ship. There's again another apocryphal story that one Russian shell made its way into Togo's command center, but it was a dud and didn't explode. And apparently Togo kept this as a souvenir for years to come. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it seems pretty cool. But if that's how Togo is doing, how is Rozhdestvensky holding up? Well, Rozhdestvensky had been injured a dozen times, including in his head, his back, his legs, and there was a piece of his skull digging into his brain. He looked around and his command center was in flames. So through the fire and the smoke, he tried to reach his way around to find somewhere else to take command of the ship, but he was out of the game. And when his commanding officers found him, they brought him to the side and they evacuated him to a medical ship that would transport him to hospital. By 7 p.m. that evening, the Suvorov started to go down. Heroically, it still managed to get some shots off. During this, through the smoke and the flame, it still fired some shots. Again, I don't think it actually hit any Japanese ship, but hey, it made an effort. The next day, the battle was pretty much over. The Russians no longer had any ships or cannons capable of breaching the gap between them and the Japanese. So the Japanese could just lie back and take pot shots at the Russians. So they knew they were defeated, and they raised a white tablecloth to signal defeat. But sadly, this didn't work, because there was a previous battle with Admiral Togo where someone had raised a white flag, they stopped firing, they approached, and then the enemy started firing again. So Togo didn't believe it. So somehow, I don't know why they had this on board, but the Russians raised the Imperial Japanese flag, and eventually that brought the Battle of Tsushima to a close. To sum up the battle, Richard Hough says this, quote, "Perhaps it can be said that the Sea of Japan saw in 24 hours more human agony and suffering, bravery and cowardice, more noble acts of self-sacrifice and acts of naked self-preservation than any of the oceans have known since man first took his quarrels to this element." Despite all the shenanigans we enjoyed along the way, it's said that the Russians did fight with a lot of honor and bravery, only to be let down by a lack of proper training and equipment. Something the Russians would surely never do again. And while Rozhdestvensky was recovering in hospital, Admiral Togo even came to visit him. While there, he demanded to send a telegraph back to Russia to ask how a man of such high esteem could be kept in such poor conditions. But he also had some reassuring words for Rozhdestvensky. There is no need for a warrior to associate an honourable defeat with shame. We fighting men suffer either way, win or lose. The only question is whether or not we do our duty. During the battle, your men fought most gallantly, and I admire them all, and you in particular. I pay you my highest respects. Despite the kind words from Togo and reassurances from all of his men that he wasn't to blame, it was hard for him not to see the crumpled remains of his fleet sinking below the water, as well as the now 5,000 Russian deaths that were, as he saw, on his hands. And as he took the train back to St. Petersburg, he saw an empire in flames, as the tinderbox of revolt was kindled. Not just because of him, but definitely sparked on by his actions from the last few months. there was a military hearing in the capital where he assured everybody, no, my officers did their duty. No one betrayed anyone. You just gave us bad equipment. And somehow that worked. He was allowed to retire with a generous pension, but the rest of his life was overshadowed by this defeat. Then, to give one last moment of levity in this story, Rozhdestvensky was alive when he saw a false obituary being published for him in a newspaper. And he said, I am still alive. You must not kill me off before my time. He would die 6 months later for real from a heart attack. So why was the Russo-Japanese War so important? Sadly, it wasn't because of the drunken monkey fights, and it wasn't because of the crocodile privateers, but it caused massive political changes in Europe and the whole world for the 20th century. After the war, the two great powers are brought to the majestic location of Maine, USA, where they signed the Treaty of Portsmouth that more or less said, Russia, you have to stay out of Korea and let Japan do their thing there, which, if you ask any Korean, didn't turn out too well. Back home in Japan, a lot of people started to riot because they felt they were not treated very fairly. And after all, it was a war they won. Why shouldn't they get everything they wanted? But that is nothing compared to what happened in Russia. Now, the Bolsheviks took over in 1917. There was a huge revolt and that happened. But before that, that's kind of seen in Russian history as the Second Revolution. There was a big revolution in 1905 as well. But Tsar Nicholas II was just about able to keep power by introducing a democratically elected government called the Duma. From here, left-leaning speakers were able to speak with not as much fear of being assassinated. But over the years, Tsar Nicholas would shut down the Duma, reinstate the Duma, take some of their powers away, give their powers back, shut it down. But all of this annoyed the Russian people and called for the end of monarchy more and more and more. And this eventually led to the end of 300 years of the Romanov rule in Russia. Outside of the two powers that were involved in the conflict, you had the United States and Europe combing over battle reports intensively, because this was the first modern war with modern ships, and on the ground you had modern tactics. And a lot of these studies led to the tactics that would be used in World War I. And then as well as that, 40 years later, Japan thought, hey, the attack on Port Arthur went so well. What if we do the same shock and awe tactics again in World War II? Except this time, they chose an enemy that they had vastly underestimated. And that is what we now know as the attack on Pearl Harbor, which finally dragged the United States into World War II. So, yeah. As silly and all as this story is, it had quite huge ramifications for 20th century history. Thank you so much for sticking through to the end. I know this got quite long. It was meant to be like a short, silly video about sailors getting their syphilis-riddled bodies bitten by snakes and dying of alcoholism. But when I started to read more into it, I realized there was a far bigger story to tell. So again, if you like what you see here, please go check out Lines Out by Donkeys, or if you want more detail about the battles and the actual logistics and stuff, go read The Fleet That Had to Die by Richard Hough. This video would not have been possible without that book, as a lot of the sources online I found are very sparse or sometimes contrarian. Either way, give the guys a look. Anyways, I'm not sure what my next video will be yet, but make sure to subscribe or comment or follow me on social media, which will be linked somewhere. And I will see you guys soon. Slán live.